Hi everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Anna. Today I have a new story for you, called Learning to Fly. It's about a man who finally pursues a childhood dream in his 40s, and discovers that some dreams are absolutely worth the wait. As always, just relax and listen, and let's begin. Kevin Marsh turned 45 years old on a quiet Tuesday, and instead of feeling particularly celebratory, he found himself feeling strangely reflective, even slightly unsettled. Sitting at his kitchen table that evening, looking through old childhood photographs his mother had recently given him, Kevin came across a picture of himself at around 10 years old, standing proudly beside a small airplane during a local air show, wearing an enormous, delighted grin. Kevin remembered that day vividly, remembered the overwhelming excitement watching small planes perform loops and turns overhead, remembered declaring confidently to his parents that he would definitely become a pilot when he grew up. He recalled his father laughing warmly, ruffling his hair, and saying something like "we'll see," a response Kevin had interpreted as complete confidence at the time, though looking back now, he suspected his father had simply been humoring an excited 10-year-old. Somewhere along the way, between college, a demanding career in logistics management, marriage, and raising 2 children, that particular childhood dream had quietly disappeared, replaced by practical, responsible adult priorities. Kevin couldn't even pinpoint exactly when he had stopped thinking about flying altogether, the dream simply fading gradually into the background of a busy, ordinary adult life, the way many childhood ambitions eventually do. "You okay?" his wife, Diane, asked, noticing him staring thoughtfully at the old photograph. "I used to want to be a pilot," Kevin said, somewhat surprised by his own words. "I completely forgot about that until just now." Diane studied the photograph, then looked at her husband carefully. "Why don't you actually learn now?" she asked. "The kids are older, we're financially stable. What's actually stopping you?" Kevin hadn't seriously considered this possibility in over 3 decades, but Diane's straightforward question lingered in his mind over the following weeks. Eventually, still feeling somewhat uncertain, Kevin researched local flight schools, discovering a small aviation academy at the regional airport only 20 minutes from his home, offering private pilot training for complete beginners. After considerable deliberation, Kevin scheduled an introductory flight lesson, telling himself this was simply an exploratory experience, nothing more serious than satisfying old childhood curiosity. The introductory lesson took place on a clear, calm Saturday morning. Kevin arrived at the small regional airport feeling unexpectedly nervous, greeted by his assigned flight instructor, a confident, friendly woman named Captain Rodriguez, who had been flying professionally for nearly 20 years. "Most people who take this introductory flight end up hooked immediately," Captain Rodriguez told him as they walked toward a small, 2-seat training aircraft. "Let's see if you're one of them." During the flight itself, with Captain Rodriguez handling takeoff and most technical controls, Kevin experienced something he hadn't anticipated, an overwhelming, almost emotional sense of freedom and excitement, watching his familiar hometown shrink beneath them, the landscape transforming into something beautifully unfamiliar from this new perspective. He recognized his own street from above, his children's school, the small lake where his family often spent summer weekends, all suddenly rearranged into a completely different, fascinating pattern viewed from several thousand feet in the air. Captain Rodriguez even allowed him brief control of the aircraft during smooth, level flight, guiding his hands gently as Kevin nervously but excitedly kept the small plane steady. The controls felt more responsive than he expected, requiring only small, careful adjustments rather than dramatic movements, and Kevin found himself grinning uncontrollably, completely absorbed in the sensation of genuinely flying, even briefly. Landing back at the airport 30 minutes later, Kevin felt genuinely transformed, his earlier hesitation completely evaporated, replaced by determined, renewed enthusiasm. "I need to actually do this properly," Kevin told Diane that evening, genuine excitement evident in his voice for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Not just one introductory flight. I want to get my full pilot's license." Diane smiled, clearly pleased seeing her husband this genuinely enthusiastic. "Then let's figure out how to make that happen," she said supportively. Kevin enrolled officially in the Academy's private pilot program the following week, beginning what would become nearly a year-long journey combining practical flight training with extensive classroom study covering aviation regulations, weather patterns, navigation techniques, and aircraft mechanics. The theoretical coursework proved considerably more demanding than Kevin initially anticipated. Balancing his full-time management position with evening study sessions covering complex topics like airspace regulations and meteorology left him feeling mentally exhausted many evenings, questioning occasionally whether he had genuinely underestimated the commitment required. He purchased a thick stack of aviation textbooks, filled with diagrams explaining different categories of controlled airspace, weather pattern symbols, and complicated navigation calculations involving wind speed and aircraft heading. Some evenings, after a full day managing his demanding logistics team, Kevin found himself reading the same paragraph about airspace classifications 3 or 4 times before the information genuinely registered. "I forgot how much actual studying this would involve," Kevin admitted to Diane one particularly tiring evening, surrounded by aviation textbooks at their kitchen table. "I haven't studied like this since university." "You're doing wonderfully," Diane reassured him. "Just take it one lesson, one chapter, at a time." Kevin's teenage daughter, Emily, noticing her father's late-night study sessions, occasionally sat with him at the kitchen table doing her own school homework, the two of them quietly quizzing each other, Emily testing Kevin on aviation terminology while Kevin helped her review vocabulary for an upcoming exam, an unexpected bonding routine neither had anticipated but both genuinely enjoyed. Kevin's practical flight training progressed alongside his classroom studies, each weekly lesson building steadily upon previous skills. Captain Rodriguez proved to be a patient, thorough instructor, never rushing Kevin through concepts before he felt genuinely confident, though also pushing him appropriately outside his comfort zone when necessary. During his 8th lesson, Kevin experienced his first genuinely frightening moment during flight training. Practicing a routine maneuver called a stall recovery, deliberately reducing the aircraft's speed until it momentarily lost lift before recovering control, something considered fundamental safety training for all pilots, Kevin felt a surge of genuine panic as the aircraft briefly dropped unexpectedly. The sensation felt considerably more dramatic than the calm, theoretical description Captain Rodriguez had provided beforehand, the aircraft's nose dipping suddenly, an unfamiliar warning sound filling the cockpit, his stomach lurching uncomfortably in a way that reminded him briefly of a roller coaster drop. For a split second, Kevin's mind went completely blank, all his careful preparation seemingly evaporating in the face of genuine, immediate fear. "I've got it," Captain Rodriguez said calmly, though she allowed Kevin to complete the actual recovery himself under her close supervision. "You handled that exactly correctly, Kevin. That momentary fear is completely normal, even necessary. It keeps you appropriately respectful of what you're doing up here." Despite his racing heart, Kevin successfully completed the maneuver, pushing the nose forward slightly and adding power exactly as trained, feeling the aircraft respond immediately and return to stable, controlled flight. Gradually, through repeated practice during subsequent lessons, this particular exercise became considerably less frightening, eventually feeling almost routine, though Kevin privately admitted he never fully lost that small flutter of adrenaline each time he intentionally approached a stall. Around the 4th month of training, Kevin faced a different kind of challenge entirely. His demanding work schedule created a particularly hectic period, forcing him to postpone several scheduled lessons due to unavoidable business trips and important deadlines. His company was expanding into a new regional market, requiring extensive travel and long hours that left him with little energy or availability for his flight training over nearly 3 consecutive weeks. This unexpected interruption left him feeling frustrated, worried his hard-earned progress might deteriorate during the unplanned break. He found himself mentally reviewing flight procedures during long, boring layovers at various airports during his business travel, determined not to lose the momentum he had built over the preceding months. When Kevin finally returned to training after nearly 3 weeks away, he felt noticeably rusty during his first lesson back, struggling with maneuvers that had previously felt increasingly natural and comfortable. "This is completely normal after a break," Captain Rodriguez reassured him, noticing his visible frustration. "Flying skills fade somewhat without regular practice, but they return remarkably quickly too. Give yourself today's lesson simply to reacquaint yourself, without judging your performance too harshly. Her reassurance proved accurate. Within 2 additional lessons, Kevin's confidence and skill returned fully, and he resumed his previous steady progress toward increasingly advanced flying skills. By the 6th month, Kevin had accumulated sufficient flight hours and demonstrated adequate proficiency for Captain Rodriguez to begin seriously discussing his first solo flight, a significant milestone in any pilot's training where the student flies completely alone for the very first time, without any instructor aboard. The prospect of flying entirely alone filled Kevin with a complicated mixture of intense excitement and genuine terror. Despite months of consistent, careful training, the idea of controlling an aircraft entirely by himself, without Captain Rodriguez's reassuring presence beside him, felt considerably more intimidating than any previous training milestone. "Am I actually ready for this?" Kevin asked nervously during the lesson immediately preceding his scheduled solo flight. "I wouldn't send you up there if I had any doubts," Captain Rodriguez told him firmly. "I've watched your progress carefully for 6 months. You're genuinely ready, Kevin, even if it doesn't fully feel that way yet." The morning of Kevin's first solo flight arrived clear and calm, ideal conditions specifically chosen to minimize additional variables during this significant milestone. Kevin had barely slept the night before, his mind cycling repeatedly through every procedure he had practiced over the preceding 6 months, determined not to forget anything critical during this pivotal moment. Diane and both of Kevin's teenage children came to watch, standing near the airport fence, waving encouragingly as Kevin completed his pre-flight inspection with methodical, practiced precision, checking fuel levels, control surfaces, and various mechanical components exactly as he had done dozens of times before, though today each familiar check felt weighted with considerably more significance. Captain Rodriguez accompanied him for one final practice circuit around the airport before finally stepping out of the aircraft, offering brief, confident final words. "You've got this completely under control," she said. "Just like every other time we've done this together. The only difference today is I'm not physically sitting beside you." Taxiing toward the runway alone for the very first time, Kevin felt his heart pounding intensely, his hands slightly trembling despite his months of careful preparation. Receiving clearance from air traffic control, he pushed the throttle forward, and the small aircraft accelerated down the runway before lifting smoothly into the clear morning sky. Flying alone for those first few minutes felt like an entirely different experience compared to every previous lesson, despite performing exactly the same familiar maneuvers he had practiced dozens of times with Captain Rodriguez beside him. The silence beside him, the absence of her calm, guiding voice, made everything feel simultaneously more intense and more genuinely his own accomplishment. Kevin found himself talking quietly to himself throughout the short flight, narrating each step exactly as Captain Rodriguez had taught him, a habit that seemed to help calm his racing thoughts. Completing the standard circuit successfully, Kevin brought the aircraft in for landing, touching down considerably smoother than he had anticipated given his nervous anticipation beforehand. Taxiing back toward the hangar, he could see Diane and his children cheering enthusiastically, Captain Rodriguez standing nearby with an unmistakably proud smile. Climbing out of the cockpit, Kevin felt an overwhelming surge of emotion, tears unexpectedly filling his eyes as Diane rushed forward to embrace him tightly. "You actually did it," Diane said, genuine pride evident in her voice. "I'm so incredibly proud of you." "That was the most terrifying, incredible thing I've ever done," Kevin admitted, still slightly shaking from the intense combination of adrenaline and emotion. Following aviation tradition, Captain Rodriguez cut a small piece from the back of Kevin's shirt, a long-standing custom historically meant to mark a student pilot's first successful solo flight, writing the date and a brief congratulatory note on the fabric before pinning it proudly on the training academy's wall alongside dozens of similar fabric pieces from previous successful students. With his first solo flight successfully completed, Kevin's training intensified over the following months, progressing toward more advanced skills, longer cross-country flights navigating between different airports, night flying training, and increasingly complex emergency procedure practice, all essential requirements before attempting his final practical examination, commonly called a checkride, required to officially earn his private pilot's license. His first solo cross-country flight, navigating to an airport nearly 60 miles away without any instructor assistance, tested skills considerably beyond his earlier training: careful flight planning, precise navigation using landmarks and instruments, and competent radio communication with unfamiliar air traffic controllers along the route. Kevin spent an entire evening beforehand meticulously planning his route, calculating fuel requirements and identifying checkpoints along the way, determined to arrive fully prepared. Night flying training brought its own unique challenges entirely, familiar landscapes transforming into unrecognizable patterns of scattered lights below, runway markings requiring careful attention that daytime flying rarely demanded. Kevin found night flying simultaneously more peaceful and more demanding than daytime flights, the darkness requiring heightened trust in his instruments rather than simply looking outside the cockpit window. The Checkride itself, scheduled nearly 10 months after Kevin's very first introductory flight, involved both an extensive oral examination testing his aviation knowledge and a comprehensive practical flight test demonstrating his actual piloting abilities, conducted by an independent, officially certified examiner rather than Captain Rodriguez herself. The night before his scheduled checkride, Kevin barely slept, mentally reviewing countless aviation regulations, weather patterns, and emergency procedures, terrified of forgetting something critical during the demanding oral examination portion. "You've prepared thoroughly for this entire journey," Diane reminded him gently, noticing his obvious anxiety. "Trust everything you've already learned." The checkride day arrived with typical autumn weather, slightly overcast but well within acceptable flying conditions. The examiner, a serious, experienced man named Mr. Fitzgerald, began with nearly 2 hours of detailed oral questioning, testing Kevin's knowledge across numerous aviation topics: airspace regulations, weather interpretation, aircraft systems, emergency procedures, and detailed flight planning calculations, before finally proceeding toward the practical flight examination. Kevin felt his palms sweating throughout much of the oral portion, occasionally pausing several seconds before answering, carefully organizing his thoughts before responding rather than rushing into potentially incorrect answers. Mr. Fitzgerald's expression remained carefully neutral throughout, offering no clear indication whether Kevin's responses were satisfactory or concerning. During the actual flight portion, Mr. Fitzgerald deliberately introduced several simulated emergency scenarios, testing Kevin's ability to remain calm and respond appropriately under pressure, exactly the kind of challenging situations Captain Rodriguez had spent months preparing him to handle competently. At one point, Mr. Fitzgerald simulated a sudden engine problem, watching carefully as Kevin methodically worked through the appropriate emergency checklist, identifying a suitable emergency landing location and communicating clearly throughout the entire simulated crisis. After what felt like an agonizingly long flight, though it actually lasted just under 2 hours, Kevin successfully landed the aircraft, uncertain how his overall performance had been evaluated. Mr. Fitzgerald remained notably quiet as they taxied back toward the hangar, offering no immediate indication of Kevin's results. Once the aircraft was properly secured, Mr. Fitzgerald finally turned toward Kevin with a genuine, warm smile. "Congratulations," he said, extending his hand. "You've successfully earned your private pilot's license." Kevin felt an overwhelming wave of relief and pride wash over him simultaneously, barely able to process the significance of what he had just accomplished after nearly a year of dedicated, sometimes challenging effort. Captain Rodriguez, waiting nearby throughout the examination, rushed forward to congratulate him enthusiastically the moment Mr. Fitzgerald departed. "I'm so proud of you," she said, embracing him warmly. "Watching someone complete this entire journey, especially someone who started as nervous and uncertain as you did, never gets old for me." That evening, Kevin's entire family celebrated together at their favorite restaurant, Diane raising a toast to her husband's remarkable, unexpected achievement. "To finally becoming the pilot that 10-year-old boy always dreamed of being," Diane said, smiling warmly at her husband. His son, Michael, 17 years old and generally not prone to overt sentimentality, surprised Kevin by raising his own glass afterward. "Dad, this is honestly pretty cool," Michael said. "Most of my friends' parents just come home from work and watch television. You went and learned to actually fly a plane." Kevin laughed, genuinely touched by this simple, teenage compliment. Maybe it's not too late for you to find your own version of this someday too, he told his son. In the following months, Kevin began taking his family on short recreational flights during weekends, sharing this newfound passion with Diane and his children, watching their own excitement mirror the same overwhelming joy he had experienced during that very first introductory flight nearly a year earlier. Emily particularly loved these weekend flights, often bringing her camera to photograph the landscape from above, while Michael peppered Kevin with technical questions about the aircraft's various systems. He also maintained a close friendship with Captain Rodriguez, occasionally returning to the academy simply to chat about aviation or share updates about his continued flying adventures, genuinely grateful for her patient mentorship throughout his entire challenging, rewarding journey. Reflecting occasionally on his remarkable experience, Kevin often thought back to that quiet, unremarkable 45th birthday evening, discovering the old childhood photograph that had unexpectedly reignited a dream he had long ago abandoned as impractical or unrealistic. He felt genuinely grateful he had finally pursued this meaningful goal, rather than allowing it to remain permanently buried beneath decades of practical, responsible adult priorities. It's never too late to become who you always wanted to be, Kevin often told colleagues and friends curious about his unexpected new hobby. I spent 30 years assuming that dream had simply expired. Turns out, it was just quietly waiting. And that's the end of today's story, Learning to Fly. I really love this story because it shows something meaningful. Childhood dreams don't necessarily disappear forever, even after decades of practical adult responsibilities, if we're eventually brave enough to revisit them. Before you go, think about this. Is there a childhood dream you once had that quietly disappeared somewhere along the way? What would it take to revisit it now? Thank you so much for listening today. This has been Anna, and this is the podcast. See you in the next episode. Take care, and keep practicing your English.